You have been writing about the ongoing conflict in Palestine, and I wanted to start with the US role in this ongoing genocide in Gaza. The Biden administration has now bypassed the Congress twice to pass emergency armed packages, and this is despite a huge documentation about US bombs being dropped in Gaza consistently, including the 2,000 pounds bunker busters that has killed several hundreds. And then there are developments on the other sides, like 60% of Americans don't support Israel in this conflict. There is a new development of US organized labor that is increasingly withdrawing its support. There are constraints on the fiscal side as the US military spending has exceeded $1 trillion, including all the emergency packages. And yet we see a very confident Israel about the US support in this ongoing conflict. Explain to us this.
Well, I think the confidence is misplaced. It has been the fact for decades that the U.S. political system has backed Israel pretty much unconditionally. But I think that this is no longer true. And I think the Israeli leadership calculations are mistaken. The public is very unhappy and very worried about the developments in Gaza. There's very strong opposition to what Israel is doing among younger people. Biden is suffering politically in terms of the opinion polls and election prospects as a result of the disarray of U.S. foreign policy. So I think that if the Israeli government expects that this is the normal smooth ride, they will be mistaken. Now, it's true that there is a powerful pro-Israel lobby. There is a powerful support in the military-industrial complex. It has been the norm in the U.S. Congress to appropriate funds for Israel pretty much without question. Politicians like Biden, who's an old man after all, have taken it for granted that a pro-Israel stand is always the right electoral as well as the right money-raising stand. But I think that this is a wrong assessment by U.S. politicians because the public is not supportive. And it's a wrong assessment, especially by the Israeli politicians who I think are making a very, very serious miscalculation.
Just to stay on this point, I mean, it is often said that while the American public has a huge leverage in terms of, or at least some leverage in terms of influencing its internal policies, when it comes to foreign policy, it is often said that what goes on in the public doesn't influence a lot in terms of the foreign policies. You have mentioned about the Jewish funding, but there are also talks about the American strategic.
Well, it's not just Jewish funding; it's Christian funding. It's
Yes.
there is a quite broad, and it's military-industrial complex funding. It's quite a broad coalition.
Right, absolutely. And I was just coming to the broad region in general. We are seeing a lot of tension with around the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and rockets being fired by the Houthis, and then US-led coalition has sunk boats on the other side. And we are seeing constant firing across the Lebanon border since October 8, if not earlier. And effectively, Netanyahu's cabinet, from Gallant to Gantz to his finance ministry, Smotrich, they are essentially calling for war against Iran. Now, to my mind, it's very difficult, or it's almost inconceivable to think about this very extended war by Israel alone if there is no thinking that US is not going to support or back them up. Your thoughts on that?
Well, if the U.S. doesn't back up Israel, Israel can't even keep up the war in Gaza, much less a wider Middle East war. The war in Gaza is supported by U.S. munitions almost on a daily basis. So if the U.S. cuts support Israel has to stop, period. It's not a matter of extending to Lebanon, the Red Sea, Iran. That would be a major war. By the way, a major war not only for Israel, but a major war for the United States as well. And the U.S. has just sent one carrier group back from the region back to the United States. So it's a signal that the U.S. is not at all interested in a wider war. There are crazy U.S. politicians like Lindsey Graham who loves war anytime, anywhere. And he said we need to bomb Iran. He used even more extreme language. But basically, this is not the position of the Pentagon, and it's not the position of the American people. You raised the question of whether the public has some say in foreign policy. In general, not very much. But being an election year this year, it's strange, but foreign policy is much more on the agenda because there's a sense that Biden is incompetent, has lost control, that the U.S. is pulled into too many conflicts. And this is weighing on public opinion, especially because Donald Trump has been against funding Ukraine and the
But not Israel, right?
The Republican base is really not in favor of this spending, or particularly in terms of these wars. It's complicated, but I think in general, the mood in the United States is, my God, we've got enough problems at home. What the hell are we doing getting into more and more and more of these wars? And Biden looks very weak and inconsequential, and he's a poor communicator in general. So this is a time when American public opinion is having an effect, especially in the Republican Party, which is not really wanting to fund Biden's adventures abroad.
I remember this foreign affairs column at the peak of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. It was saying that we should bump up our support for NATO. It's not enough because the Republicans can come and they would definitely withdraw support, and we should keep this going. And we would come to Ukraine. But before that, if you could very quickly, if you could lay out this 8-point proposal that you laid out in one of your columns about how to achieve peace in the region.
Well, it's basically 1 point, which is I would like the UN Security Council today to vote the state of Palestine as a UN member state, and for that to be confirmed by the UN General Assembly, and to get on with the two-state solution. Of course, the current political constellation in Israel is dead set against this. It is absolutely intent on complete control, not only over Israel, but over Palestine. That's the real agenda. It's a self-destructive agenda as well as a deadly agenda vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. And I would like the international community to cut through this and say, look, we've had 57 years of resolutions now, almost 57 years, UN Security Council Resolution 242. And this is that there need to be two states on the 4 June 1967 borders. And that's it. And we're moving to that solution because otherwise, well, there is no solution of peace. So this is not easy to do, but the alternatives are much worse, actually. So this is what I would recommend. Of course, then there would be peacekeepers, and that would be peacekeepers to separate the two sides, and that seems to me to be utterly feasible. There would be a normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab and Islamic neighbors, but based on Palestine being a sovereign state with control over Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Islamic holy sites. But this is what has been on the table for decades. And I would urge the international community to just move to this solution, because under the UN Charter, Security Council has the power to do this. It is in the interests of global peace to do this. There's one country that blocks it from happening, and that's the United States. And I'm hoping that when the overwhelming global opinion is on the other side, and when the alternative is so horrible as it is, and when the Israeli leaders are so vulgar and violent in their stated intentions, that this will also change the US position.
I want to move to Ukraine, but very quickly, if you can respond to just two additional questions on this. One is, as you mentioned about the Republicans either coming to power or taking charge of or continuing charge of Congress and that having some influence. I was wondering if there is a division between Republican policies or intent when it comes to Ukraine or Russia and when it comes to Palestine, because Donald Trump, for instance, during his presidency, while he was a dovish when it came to Russia, he was an absolute hawkish when it came to not just China, but also in Palestine. I mean, his policies were far more regressive than even some kind of moderate Obama. So that's one point. And the other point is many people now are increasingly disillusioned by the idea of the two-state settlement, two-state solution, given there are these 700,000 settlements and so on and so forth. Very quick response, because we have to discuss the rest of it.
Yeah, don't think of the Republican Party or even Donald Trump as having coherent, unified, consistent ideas, either internally consistent or consistent over time. These are political movements, and Donald Trump himself is not a stable personality. So don't look for consistency. When it comes to one-state solution or two-state solution, they're both possible. I think both parties would prefer a two-state solution. That is also international law. The settlements are illegal. The settlers would have to go home to a very large extent. When those settlements took place, they were known to be illegal. The UN Security Council has been very clear over the years that they are illegal. This is the tragedy. Israel tried to put facts on the ground. Well, it put facts on the ground that have led to disaster. That was predictable at the time. It's happening right now. We need an answer. Okay, they could live in one state, but not an apartheid state. That's not an answer for peace. Or they could live in two states. But if they live in two states, they have to solve the problem that hundreds of thousands of settlers, many of them highly religious zealots, listening to biblical ideas from 2,600 years ago, not current realities in the world, need to adjust to current realities. So this is tough, but the current situation, the status quo, is a complete disaster. So I'm saying go with international law, go with decades of international law, go with the solution that both sides claim they prefer to somehow forcing one state together, and therefore solve the problem even of the settlements.
Let's come to Ukraine. On December 30, the New York Times reports on an Ukrainian bombardment of the Russian city of Volgorod that killed 22 people, perhaps the deadliest single attack on a Russian city since the start of the war. And this has been followed up by what the New York Times reports as heavy barrage of hypersonic Russian missiles into cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv and others. So there seems to be a renewed conflict there. My question basically is, and this is mostly from my reading of the Financial Times, there seems to be an uneasiness within European elites in particular about some sort of reluctance on part of Washington, D.C. about continuing this war in Ukraine. In fact, Financial Times columnists are writing columns encouraging Ukraine to come up with its own war industries because Washington might not help it anymore. Do you see this to be based on ground, or do you think it's a completely misplaced perception?
First, when you read the Financial Times, remember that you're reading a British newspaper. Britain has been Russophobic and at war with Russia essentially for more than 200 years. Britain hates Russia more than just about anything else Britain does. And Britain has been fighting the Crimean War since 1856. So this is just the Financial Times doing its normal thing. And the British media are even more outrageous than the US media. The fact of the matter is two things. One, this war should have and could have been avoided because it's a war over NATO enlargement, and the United States pushed NATO enlargement stupidly, naively, as a gamble, thinking it would get away with anything. It lost the gamble. That's point number one. Point number two is Russia is crushing Ukraine on the battlefield, and Ukraine is bleeding terribly with hundreds of thousands of deaths and casualties, and is outgunned, outmanned, out-technologied, and the U.S. And the West don't have even in their stockpiles right now the 155 millimeter shells and other equipment. Unless this thing goes nuclear, which would end the world, Russia is prevailing on the battlefield. It's a very straightforward, tragic, again, utterly predictable point. Let me be clear: the U.S. is completely incompetent in foreign policy. So these debacles are foreseeable. These are not retrospective ideas. The Financial Times is filled with nonsense if it thinks that Ukraine is going to fight this on its own. But what it's saying that the U.S. is not pursuing this is probably true. The Congress is going to return this month, most likely turning down further funding for Ukraine. I sure hope so. This funding doesn't do Ukraine any good. It just kills more and more people in Ukraine. It just keeps the war going. Of course, in the end, the military-industrial complex has a powerful lobby, and it may be able to keep another round of some level of aid. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. public is against continued funding. The war is not going the way that these fools in the administration believed that it would, or these gamblers believed that it would. And so I think we are in an end game, and there should be negotiations, just as there were negotiations last year in March and April 2022 that would have ended the war. But the United States said, no, you have to keep fighting because we want to keep enlarging NATO. It's pretty much as simple as that. We need to negotiate an end to the war based on no NATO enlargement.
If there is one voice who seems to be absolutely unwavering in not ending the war is Zelensky. Like, he seems to be absolutely against ending the. Where does he get the confidence from?
Well, I don't know if it's confidence or desperation, or many people have said to me, he'd be killed if he tried anything different from the inside right wing, or like many politicians who have staked everything on a particular position, he can't back down because that would mean the immediate end of his power. I don't think it's confidence. I think it's complete desperation. And I think we're in an end game.
What's the alternative? What's the opposition to Zelensky that you can think of or imagine replacing in Ukraine?
Well, there could be a coup from inside. There could be a military defeat. There could be a rout on the battlefield. There could be an overthrow of the government. There could be a political change to any of the competitors like Zaluzhny or others. But the current situation is an end game. Ukraine is being absolutely ravaged and savaged on the battlefield right now. They're trying to mobilize people, basically grabbing them off the streets. It's terrible. I think the public support has disappeared. That's why Zelensky said no elections. So we're very close to the end game.
Let's come to the market transition in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. You were very close in terms of the project in Poland, and you were involved in some of the early experiments in Russia before you had to back out, or you were probably pushed aside.
No.
Yes.
Look, these weren't experiments. The idea was to stabilize a financial crisis and to help countries move to a normal mixed economy. In the case of Poland, that was tumultuous but very successful. It launched 30 years of rapid economic development in Poland and a lot of catching up of living standards and technology and so forth. But the reason was that Poland had a geopolitical support from the United States and Europe. The problem with Russia was that the United States viewed Russia as an enemy that it didn't want to support. And in fact, as soon as the Soviet Union went down, the hardliners in the United States, who became called the neocons, said, well, let's break up Russia too. And so the war against the Soviet Union never ended. It just carried on to a kind of war against Russia with NATO enlargement, with other actions to try to undermine Russia's security and its power. So I saw early on, I tried to get US financial support to Gorbachev before the Soviet Union ended, and then to Yeltsin when Russia and the other 14 republics of the Soviet Union became independent states. But in neither case was there any interest in the United States for that kind of constructive approach. So I resigned. I resigned twice, actually. I resigned after the first year, and then the Russian government begged me, please help us one more year. And I tried again, and there was no interest in the last year of the Bush administration, then the first year of the Clinton administration. So I resigned again at the end of 1993. I wasn't pushed aside. I was just useless because what I believed needed to be done was geopolitical, which was to make a normal relationship between the US, Europe, and Russia. And in Poland, that was kind of second nature. But when it came to Russia, it was beyond the imagination or the intention of the US government.
So was it the US lack of cooperation that disillusioned you, or was it Yeltsin being able to push through some of these reforms because his parliament was vetoing some of what you were suggesting?
This was essentially a geopolitical situation. When you're in such a big crisis, you have to find your place in the world first and foremost. There's a financial crisis. There's a crisis of an end of an empire, the Soviet Union. It's a dissolution of 15 countries. They need trade relations. They need finance. And the international institutions should have been there to help this function. The IMF should have played a role. But the IMF, of course, is on 19th in Pennsylvania, meaning that it's under the thumb of the United States. And the United States told the IMF, no, you don't help. And so this is really what this was about.
I want to ask you a few questions about some of the economic policies that you suggested, the bundle of which has now come to be known as shock therapy, and as you know, has increasingly come under attack, especially from the left. I want you to respond to some of these apprehensions or critiques, if you like. One of the things said is while some of your recommendations about deregulation of price controls, restoration of trade are uncontroversial, but essentially a very rapid deregulation of price control also meant what you suggested was a restrictive monetary policy, which was coupled with a very balanced budget, which led to a contraction of, which could possibly lead to contraction of the economy. And then the second side is about the privatization, which often means, definitely in the case of Russia, is very cheap privatization. There was this biscuit factory which was privatized for seven.
Okay.
Yes.
Look, this is silly. This is not. This is not what I said, and my role had nothing to do with privatization. And so there's so much nonsense about this. I was trying to help prevent a hyperinflation and to help a financial stabilization, not through austerity, quite the contrary, but through financial support for Russia so that there wouldn't have to be that kind of austerity, and through a standstill on debt repayments and a large financing package. That's the opposite of what you're saying. I was not in any way advising even on the privatization issues, and my own advice, which was not asked for because that wasn't what I was there to be doing. I was there as a financial specialist that knows a lot about how to end a financial crisis. But my own advice was the opposite, which was to be careful, go slow, prevent the stealing of enterprises, don't privatize the major resource sector like oil and gas. It's very clear. So a lot of silliness was said, but the media is filled with silliness because we're talking here about technical issues, but things for various reasons were misunderstood. So basically, the bottom line is I was trying to avoid a macroeconomic financial crisis. I was following the basic line of John Maynard Keynes, which is that when a country's in financial crisis, it needs a framework of help from outside, not a framework of punishment. That was my basic idea. It's been my basic idea all along throughout my career. And when that international help comes in a timely way, it can make a very consequential and constructive improvement of what is otherwise a very deep crisis.
I'm glad you pushed back against the privatization thing, because I think, in all honesty, your package didn't include that. I still
not at all.
Yes.
So
yes,
know, the whole thing's nonsense.
definitely.
Sorry.
Yes. I'd still like you to very quickly respond to the balanced budget and restrictive monetary policy, which seems to be were part of your package.
The balance. I didn't ask for a balanced budget. I asked for a budget that was not based on monetary financing of a deficit for a large amount. In other words, I was saying, don't balance the budget, get large-scale financial help in order so that you don't have to, quote, balance the budget. It's the opposite. It was a financial package to give support in the midst of a crisis. You see, Russia had run out of money. They were in debt. They were supposed to be repaying the debt. I said to the G7, don't ask them to repay the debt. Are you kidding? This is a severe crisis. The G7 said, no, they have to repay every penny that's falling due. It's the opposite.
Yes, I mean, when it comes to the international side, you are definitely...
No. International side's about the budget, you understand.
But what about the fiscal deficit?
The fiscal deficit is exactly, if you give money to a budget, you allow it to run a deficit in a non-inflationary way. That's it. I was trying to help them run a deficit, you see?
Right.
I was trying to get them revenues so that they could continue all of the social functions, all of the normal functions, so that they would avoid a deep financial crisis. Exactly the opposite. I was the one saying 30 billion a year for the former Soviet Union coming from the outside. People thought I was crazy. What a bargain it would have been.
What's your general assessment of the post-communist transition in Eastern Europe? You have been very open about your thoughts on Poland. You see it as a successful experiment. What's your general thought about Eastern Europe's transition? Because there are apprehensions about Eastern Europe itself. Many people say even cities like Warsaw that didn't used to have beggars are now have many more. So what's your
Are you kidding? Were you there? What? Come on, what nonsense. Look, in 1989 or 88, Poland was about a third of the per capita income level of Germany. Now it's about 70%. In other words, it's doubled relative to its German next door neighbor. That's what happens when you end the trade and finance barriers, integrate the economies, have Poland being a major industrial supplier for European industry. It became integrated into the normal European economy. That's the benefit of European Union membership. And by and large, it's geographic. If you're close to the Western European countries, you do better. If you're farther away, you do less well, because say a major company like Siemens or Volkswagen is looking for suppliers. It could go next door to Poland, or it could go farther to Romania and Bulgaria. Well, what will it do for its supply chain? It will tend to go closer. So there's a big geographic gradient in reform naturally, which is that the countries closest to the Western European countries did better. Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, Slovakia. The ones that are farther away, like Romania and Bulgaria, did less well. The places where there was chaos, like the former Yugoslavia, did even less well. The places behind the former Soviet Union, in general, did even less well, except the Baltics were grabbed for both strategic reasons and because of their very small size, and integrated into the Northern European economic matrix very quickly. So there's a lot of basic economic geography overlaid with geopolitics in this. That's the basic story.
Can I leave you with one final question, if your time
Sure.
permits? There is a lot being spoken about the future of US-China relationship, and that has a huge implication for the rest of the world. Can you share your thoughts about how you look at this relationship going forward?
Well, the big issue is China has become a superpower in every dimension, economic, technological, military, obviously population, though it's number 2 to India. But essentially, that's fine. It means that the major powers, China, India, European Union, United States, should be cooperating with each other and finding a good modus vivendi. But in the American mentality, America needs to be number 1. America needs to have dominance. So the U.S. foreign policy is based on a complete fantasy that the U.S. still runs the show, or can run the show, or can contain China. And so this is the root of the extreme tensions between the U.S. and China, basically U.S. resentment at China's success. And the U.S. is therefore trying to hinder China, trying to contain China, trying to slow China's rise, trying to organize military alliances against China. To my mind, this is all very dangerous and misguided. China is just having a return to economic success, and it should be applauded, not opposed. So I'm for a cooperative, multipolar, multilateral approach. India is going to be the same situation. Right now, India and the US, say that they are close in foreign policy, but when India gets too powerful and successful, the United States will turn against India too. So basically, we need to avoid what John Mearsheimer calls the tragedy of great power politics. And he says it's inevitable that there should be conflict among great powers because they fight for each other for survival. I say to him, John, we don't need tragedy, we need cooperation. So countries should cooperate with each other, stop the bullying. If the United States never again used the phrase rule-based international order, it would be too soon, because that just has become the code stock phrase for the US-led order. We don't need a US-led order. We need a multipolar, multilateral order, starting with the UN Charter. I'd like to see India join the UN Security Council as a permanent member. It obviously should be there. So we need some reforms of the UN system, but basically we need multilateralism, not great power showdowns. But the United States, for the moment, is still in a mentality of thinking it's the indispensable leader of the world, which is nonsense. It's just 4% of the world population. We've, by the way, gotten enough problems internally and domestically, politically, economically, and socially, that we have a lot of healing to do in the United States without trying to run the rest of the world.
Did you convince Professor Mearsheimer? Because he seems to be believing that the idea of US hegemony is something indispensable or the whole world will fall into chaos. What did he respond to you?
He doesn't say it quite that way. What he says is that it's inevitable that the US will seek hegemonic power, that that's the tragedy of great power politics, that great powers are inevitably led to seek either regional or even global hegemony. I say no. We don't agree on that. We're good friends. I admire him enormously, but we don't agree, because if you write a book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, my view is you have to solve the tragedy. You can't just leave it as a tragedy. We have to say, okay, that's the risk. What's the solution? John says, well, there is no solution. That's the reality. And I say, no, there is a solution. The solution is multilateralism and multipolarity.
On that note of optimism, Professor Sachs, thank you very much for your time.
Summarize your main proposals, how to deal with this long conflict. By the way, it's the long unsolved conflict in younger history, because it started already immediately after the Second World War, and it's still unsolved, and the world is listening and watching, but doing nothing. So what are your proposals?
Just to say that this conflict, in a way, started 100 years ago. It started after World War I. Britain, in its typical way, promised this land to several different groups, all in typical British cynicism, including a Jewish homeland, an Arab state, promised to the French a mandate, you name it. But basically, we've been, since the end of World War I and the end of the Ottoman Empire, on the question, what is to happen with this land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And in 1947 and 48, the UN, which just got formed, had the idea of a partition between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And Israel accepted it. The Palestinian and Arab side said it wasn't a fair deal. A war ensued when Israel unilaterally declared its independence. Israel won that war, and a state of Israel was established, but no state of Palestine was established. Then in 1967, with the June 1967 war, Israel took military control over the Palestinian territories as well, meaning East Jerusalem, the West Bank territory, and Gaza. And we've been in that situation since 1967, where Israel has military control over the three areas of what would be Palestine. Now, international law, as reflected in the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly for basically 57 years, has said there needs to be two states living in peace side by side. I agree with that, certainly. And international law says that should be along the borders of the 4th of June, 1967. And I agree with that proposition as well. But starting in the early 1970s, Israel began to settle in the conquered territories. It claimed East Jerusalem for its own country, essentially annexing it, saying that a unified Jerusalem is permanent, and it put hundreds of thousands of settlers, or allowed hundreds of thousands of settlers, or a combination of the two, into the occupied West Bank, and some into Gaza, though the situation in Gaza is more complicated. But essentially, Israel settled in the occupied territories. And the idea from the secular point of view was make a two-state solution impossible, basically, other than one that Israel would control or dominate. But what happened starting in the 1970s is that these settlers got a mind of their own, and these are, to a very significant extent, religious zealots, not all of them, but many of them, who say, well, God gave us all this land. We have the right to permanently dominate the Palestinian people. This is a view that I think most of the world would not accept, and the secular world would not accept. But it is a big part of the problem now, because over time, this zealous religious movement, an extreme nationalist movement that says all of this land is for the Jews, became the dominant part of Israeli politics. So what's happening in Gaza right now is not a war on Hamas to limit the danger from Hamas, which is actually much more limited than Israel claims. But it is actually a war on the Palestinian people and on the idea of an independent state of Palestine, because this government in Israel, and a large part of the population now, says no, there will be one state, it will be Israel, we will control everything. But the whole rest of the world doesn't agree with that. And they shouldn't agree with that. We need two states living side by side in accordance with international law. And my own view is that religious zealotry, based on a 6th century BC text of the Bible, should not dominate. What we need is what the international community has said for more than half a century is right: two states living side by side. And I advocate that the UN Security Council should impose that solution. Now, it should vote today, as far as I'm concerned, for an independent, sovereign state of Palestine based on the 4th June 1967 borders, and let's get on with it. Now, there's two obstacles. One is Israel, obviously, and its politics. The other is the United States. Israel has one backer in this present situation, which is the U.S. This is complicated because the U.S. political system and public do not buy into the greater Israel idea. They buy into a safe and secure Israel. But the U.S. has always supported the two-state solution. But politically, the U.S. is the backer that arms Israel that is enabling Israel, that is actually complicit with Israel in carrying out this massacre in Gaza and this basically this ethnic cleansing operation in Gaza. And my very specific recommendation is the United States should say to Israel, look, you know, we don't agree with you, and we're not going to arm you for this purpose. Because if the U.S. stops the military support for Israel, Israel can't do this an extra day, not even an extra day. And so there is a way for this war to stop, very practically. There is a political outcome, and that's what I think we should move to.
You mentioned, I think, the vast majority of the UN member states shared and they supported. And the problem is that the real power at the UN, in the UN system, is just with the Security Council. And as long as the Security Council has one, sometimes a second, maybe even with Britain, it was also because Britain is the source of the problem, because this was their colonial power. But how to move there? I think let's become precise. I think you presented really a plan with point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I assume that many people know it, but please give a short view what the main points of your plan. It starts with the full membership of Palestine to the UN, a full membership, because as an observer they have been already, but full membership is something else. Could you just summarize your proposals?
So my basic idea is we don't need more process. We don't need more 10 years of negotiation. We don't need another Oslo process. There's no way to say more about this issue than has been said for the last 50 years. We have to understand that the two parties cannot solve this by themselves. Each one is locked into its own extremism, and there's zero trust between the two sides, to say the least. So in this case, we have an international community that is essentially united on this with one crucial footnote, which is the United States has blocked this approach for decades, even though it is, quote, in favor of this approach. Even Biden said a couple of weeks ago, we support the two-state solution. But the United States political system has given essentially a blank check to Israel for decades, so that it murmurs support for the two-state solution, but it does not enforce it. American politicians have long believed for decades that support for Israel is vital for their political health, because they have believed that that's where the big campaign contributions come from. That's in line with the military-industrial complex system, which is politically quite powerful. And they believe that's where public opinion is. But in the U.S., public opinion has turned against Israel because the American people do not want to be complicit in this massacre. And they are not supportive of the so-called Greater Israel, which means Israel dominance over Palestine. They are supportive of two states. Every opinion survey for decades has demonstrated this. That's true of American Jews, by the way, not just of the American public generally. We're not so far from that, because the Security Council is basically 13 to 1 to 1. That is 13 countries support what I'm saying. One opposes it, the United States, and one always goes along with the U.S. That's the UK. Shame on them. First of all, they should grow up. Second, they should recognize they're no longer a world empire. And third, they should take some responsibility for the mess that they left. So, but aside from that, that's a footnote as far as I'm concerned. The real story here is the U.S. And I'm trying to say to U.S. public officials, look, you're completely alone supporting something you don't even support. So you have to do something more creative. Now, unfortunately, President Biden's not creative. He lacks the energy and insight. His foreign policy team is extremely weak. So I don't know whether we'll get there or not. But the domestic politics and the international politics is all pushing in the same direction. Now, what would it mean? To my mind, instead of a new political process, it starts with the outcome. 2 states, 1967 borders. Now let's implement that. Second stage, obviously, would be that on that basis, there would be a regional agreement. The Arab states would say, we end our state of belligerence or hostility with Israel. We normalize relations. We stop supporting Hamas or other anti-Israel militia groups. We stop funding them. We start arming them. We stop giving political backing to them. That can happen. Why do I say it can happen? Because the Arab and Islamic countries have said so repeatedly. And they said it recently in Riyadh when they met in an emergency meeting after October 7 and the subsequent Israeli invasion of Gaza. So that's the second step, is the diplomatic political step. That includes Iran, by the way, because it's not only the Arab states, it's also Iran, which is, of course, a backer of Hezbollah and Hamas. But that's possible, too. But we have to also stop the hostility to Iran, which was agreed with the JCPOA agreement several years ago. And then the United States broke that. And by the way, broke it in part because of Israeli pressure. So, this was Israel pushing the U.S. to break an agreement signed with Iran. And Europe, as usual, was pitiful. It just stood by and mumbled because European leaders are afraid of the United States instead of telling the United States the truth. So this is another part of it. But anyway, second step is normalizing the diplomatic relations based on the 2 states. Third step is actually putting in peacekeepers. And the best that I've heard is that this peacekeeping force, which would operate under the mandate of the UN Security Council, would include Americans, would include troops that are drawn from the Arab countries. And the idea would be to create a buffer zone that would protect Israel from incursions like occurred on October 7. And on the basis of this political solution, would also demobilize the armed side of Hamas step by step, and would show basically that Hamas, which is a political, a military, and a cultural force, the military side would be ended as part of a political settlement. And this would be the next step. The step after that would be actually to promote economic recovery and development after this devastation. There's a lot to be said about this. It's tragic and a measure of human stupidity that in a world that needs so much, the first thing we do is destroy and then have to spend huge amounts simply to rebuild what we destroyed in a matter of days or weeks. But there is a reality now that Israel has destroyed the habitability of Gaza. Oh my God. Well, we're going to have to address this. And so this is another reality that needs to be added to the scene. But my basic point is move to a solution, not to an illusion, not to the status quo, not to what Israel wants right now, which is not to talk about the day after, because we know what Israel wants the day after. They murmur it every few days, which is complete control, which is absolutely unacceptable. Not to talk about, oh, we need to reestablish the Palestinian National Authority, blah, 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 because this is all fake. What we need to do is spell out where the solution is. 2 states, international law, living side by side, and with peacekeepers, and disarming the threats to both sides. And this is a very practical set of steps that could be reached. And I think it's not impossible. There are big issues, by the way, that I don't have an answer to. There are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who would be dead set against what I'm saying. They are settling illegally in the West Bank, many of them based on a religious fervor that they think comes from the book of Joshua from the 6th century BC. We're going to have to address this. Addressing it in human terms may mean addressing it gradually over a few years, not violently and brutally. These are human beings, in my view, completely misguided and illegal in their actions, but that needs to be addressed too. So I don't want to pretend, obviously, that I have a step-by-step solution to everything. But the point is, we've got to stop faking what's going on right now. The answer has been known for decades, but Israel has become more and more radical. And this is very sad. It's become more and more messianic in its politics. This is weird for the 21st century, but it's actually happened. So I want us to look straightforwardly, clearly at what's going on and understand this is not normal debate about security and so forth. This is about whether there's going to be peace and 2 states, or whether there's going to be an Israeli attempt to dominate millions of Palestinians, or brutally suppress them, or brutally ethnically cleanse them, or kill a lot of them. And to my mind, the only possible alternative, and the one that the whole world agrees to, is to give political self-determination to Palestine. By the way, there was a vote on that in the General Assembly recently, quite interesting. Every country in the world that voted yes, except for 4. The 4 were Israel, the United States, Micronesia, country of 113,000 people last time I checked, and Nauru, a country of 12,000 people. So basically, the whole world has said, get on with it.
So how do you create this miracle? Because even the possible alternative to Biden is Trump or somebody from the Republican. They are in certain aspects even more radical pro-Israeli than the Democrats. How to overcome this tiny problem?
Yeah, so the pressure has to come from inside the United States and from outside. From inside, public opinion absolutely does not accept the administration line on this. This is very clear in opinion survey after opinion survey. So somebody in the White House concerned about Biden's reelection must be reading this and must be understanding this is just purely bad tactics from a U.S. political point of view. That's very important. There's lots of protest in the United States and lots of unhappiness with this. So we're not in any way locked in internally to the politics. It's bad for Biden. It's bad for U.S. interests. It's against public opinion. And so this is one point that I would make. It's not like the United States is rousing support, yes, and it's impossible to turn. It's actually deeply contested and mainly opposed, though I acknowledge that in Washington, the pro-Israel lobby has always been very powerful. The military-industrial complex is very powerful, and the inertia is also powerful. So I'm not saying it's easy. Now, on the outside, the entire world is basically aligned on this side with one important footnote, which is that a few European countries maybe are not aligned. I don't know what the Austrian government's real position is. Sometimes it's don't side with the U.S., or maybe it really is because of more right-wing view or whatever, side with Israel, but it's very few. The problem in Europe is European politicians stop telling the truth about almost anything years ago because all they want to do is side with the United States. And I think I would just say to European politicians, if you do it, you lose at the polls. There isn't a popular government in Europe right now because it's incredible. This is so much against Europe's own political interests. So I would say, think through this honestly, and then say, it's right. We're not against Israel. We just need to move to a two-state solution. And the United States, come over here, buddy. You know it too. Let's move to a real solution. I'm waiting for European politicians to regain 2 feet on the ground, their head out of the clouds or out of U.S. control, and just state clearly, straightforwardly what is right and also what happens to be in Europe's interest. But by the way, what happens to be in Israel's interest as well, because nothing that's happening is doing anything other than gravely threatening Israel's long-term survival. This messianism, this greater Israel idea, this zealotry of this religious group, this is not saving Israel. This is threatening Israel's survival. So I want European leaders just to think clearly and honestly about this, because that'll also help the United States get to the right place.
I think there is a lot to say about the European leaders. I think the European leaders, there are no leaders, you know it better. And there is another tiny problem. We will have also an election this year in some European countries, but in the European Union for the European Parliament. And the problem is that everybody, according to most of the polls, it's to foresee that the right-wing European nationalistic right-wing parties will win. And the problem is they are even, at least concerning Israel, they are also in the meantime, also many of their parties, if to go back history, you know where they come from. And this is a historic cynicism. I think that these right-wing fascist parties, now they are on side of Israel, which is unbelievable for anybody who knows history and who knows how things happened, that these parties who are sometimes in internal issues, they are racistic, they are fascistoid right today, but when it comes to Israel, they are supporting the Jewish state.
Yeah, supporting the Jewish state is one thing. Supporting what is called Greater Israel to dominate the Palestinians is so senseless for Israel and for Europe that everybody should take a deep breath and understand that. How many self-wounds does Europe want? How many crises, how many wars does Europe want around it? And I would ask the European leaders, the reason why the right is growing is in part because the so-called center or center left all was gung-ho with the United States for NATO enlargement and for the war in Ukraine. And of course, it's been a disaster for Europe. It's been a disaster economically for Europe. It's been a disaster from a security point of view for Europe. So it's not even left-right. It's a failure policy that the current European governments have pursued, and they are opening up their way for an opposition to arise. And that's what's happening, in fact. So the reason European politicians, by the way, across the board, you look at the approval ratings in Western Europe right now or in the EU, nobody has any support, basically, except the few that stand up for themselves, like Orban or Fico or a few others. But the ones that are basically just siding with the United States in this useless Ukraine war are all in their 20% approval ratings or 25% approval ratings and so on. So the main point I would say to Europe is, if you go the way, not of supporting Israel, that's one thing, but supporting greater Israel for ethnic cleansing and for this terrible thing, all you're doing is making another prolonged disaster on Europe's borders. And if that's in Europe's interest, boy, please explain it to me.
This is no doubt about it. I think Europe, with this policy they follow the last tens of years, I think it's against their own security, economic, even cultural interests. I think this is something which...
I'll give you another example, by the way. The politics of the 2010s was dominated by the Syrian refugees. And anyone that knows even the slightest history should understand that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and a few others decided they would overthrow the Syrian government in 2011, typical regime change operation. That's what created the war and the refugees. Did any single European leader say that? Explain that to the public? Not one. So then they wonder, why is their popularity so low? Well, if you don't speak up the truth, what do you expect? And so understand that these hegemonic wars of the United States, these are not in Europe's interests. And that's the same with supporting what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's not a matter of right or left. It's a matter of what's Europe's interest right now. It is not to have a fulminant Middle East war right now. And so European politicians should think about how to diffuse a Mideast-wide war.
You are completely right. I think you convince people like me. Unfortunately, we are not in power. But coming back to the issue of this interview, I think now there is a peace plan. It's even economically, we didn't even mention it, but which is interesting for me, since you're also long experienced in economy. I think one important but not so much debated proposal is the establishment of a new UN fund. A UN Reconstruction and Sustainable Development Fund, which is interesting, should at least partially funded by reduction of expenses which traditionally have been spent for armament and war.
Outside the UN, across the street from headquarters, is what they call Isaiah's Wall, which is the inscription of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 4, which says they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not make war on other nations. Neither will they teach war anymore. I'm paraphrasing, but Isaiah had the idea in the 8th century BCE of the transforming the military to the civilian use. And we're now spending $2.5 trillion a year worldwide on the military. The United States is around 40% of the world's spending. Shocking, because we're 4% of the world's population. What if we take even 10% of that would be $200 billion a year. So $250 billion a year. And so that's the proposal. Create a fund funded by basically agreed cutbacks in armaments. I should mention that Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical Populorum Progressio in 1967, had that idea. So I don't want to claim any precedence to this, but I do think it's the right idea. The UN in general does not command much in financial resources. It needs to have a bigger budget to do good things. And one way would be military cutbacks that are rechanneled to sustainable development.
We could continue hours and hours and hours, since many things have been already discussed for many years. But it's interesting that now this plan is here. I think, do you have any ideas how to make it even more popular? Do you intend to present it to other international bodies? And how should this come to reality?
I'm discussing these ideas with UN diplomats all the time. And I've discussed it with Palestinian diplomats and with diplomats from around the Middle East. There's a lot of resonance with this. I personally am continuing to urge an immediate membership of Palestine in the UN as a UN member state. By the way, Palestine is a state recognized by 140 other states, but it is not recognized as a UN member state, only an observer, as you rightly pointed out. So I am continuing my own discussion of this, basically with the U.S. government. They don't talk to me too much, but I try to make my views known publicly by writing and posting articles all the time. And I'm writing to politicians in the U.S. who are quite resistant in general, because their modus operandi for decades has been never show any space at all with Israel. But I'm telling them it's not working. It's not working from any point of view. You need to rethink this. So they have a few days of rethinking before the Congress comes back. The White House cannot be very comfortable. We hear lots of stories about pretty harsh talks between the U.S. and Israel right now. I believe that that's true. One of the U.S. carrier groups has been withdrawn from the Eastern Mediterranean and is on its way back to the U.S. That is a signal that the U.S. does not want a wider war in the Middle East. I think that's absolutely right. The U.S. is exhausted of war, and an election year, it would be the end of Biden's chances at all. So this is the time for pushing the politics, because it's a case where the right thing to do, the politically expedient thing to do are the same. And so I'm going to continue to push hard on that.
Do you have any hope in, I think you mentioned it and everybody knows it, I think 2/3 of the international states are in favor of this kind of political and economic solution. Unfortunately, they don't have any veto at the UN. But there is something else. There is an increasing number of states working together. I think, and the South African move to the International Court is interesting because South Africa, on the other side, is one of the leading member states of this newly established group, the BRICS group. And they have even already established a kind of new banking system, financing system. Do you have any indications or ideas that from this side, more than just political statements will come to support your suggestions?
Well, the BRICS countries, all of them, are on the same side that I've been advocating. China, Russia, South Africa, India has expressed also some clarity on this. Brazil, certainly. And now you have new BRIC states that have just joined: Egypt, Ethiopia, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It's a powerful group. They're all on this side. Actually, it's interesting for me, the fact that Iran is now a BRICS member is actually going to moderate Iran, make it part of what could be a BRICS-wide consensus on a good solution. So this matters because the U.S. also looks out and says, our diplomacy, we're isolated, whereas China's and Russia's diplomacy is growing in the region. This cannot make anyone happy. And we know that in the U.S. State Department, there's a lot of unhappiness about the U.S. administration policy. We don't hear all the details, but it boils over every few weeks. And so we hear about the protests coming from inside the professional diplomatic service of the United States as well. So I wouldn't give up in any way on a political